Okay, so just as an FYI, I think next week because it's Pesach, so we'll probably not have share. And then I'm thinking there's maybe one more that I want to do from Yevamot. So then we'll finish it up right after Pesach. So 6 months Yevamot from right. We start right after Sukkot to Pesach, and then we'll switch to Avodah Zarah for the next 6 months. Because the Ein Yaakov for the two of them is roughly the same length. But we're nearing the end. So what I want to talk about this week is a lot more philosophical than usual, I would say. Something that I think about a lot. It's like one of my favorite topics to dwell on. And that's the tension between what's known as transcendence and immanence. Right? Where transcendence is the idea of God or divinity being beyond the material world or anything that we can know or understand. And then immanence is the opposite, in the sense that divinity being part of the world, in the materialism that we experience. And obviously this is a question that isn't unique to Judaism. It's something that's been dwelt on in philosophy for thousands of years. And kind of the two extremes, right? On the one hand, you have perhaps the prime mover, which the Rambam alludes to, it comes from Aristotle, where you have this force that's the ultimate transcendent power that is completely removed from this world, and there's these chain reactions from this unmoved mover that eventually leads to the creation of this world, but that God is totally removed from the world. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have maybe a more Spinozan approach of pantheism, where God is the world, right? That everything that we know, the materialist world, all of nature, that is God, and there's nothing beyond what we can know or experience, and everything has a naturalistic explanation. And then there's tons of shades in between, of course, but those are the two poles around this question of transcendence and immanence. And obviously the reason why it's so important is that, from a metaphysical perspective, it describes what God and his relationship with the world and with all of creation. And so it's an important theological question to understand to what extent is God in the world, removed from the world, and what underpins it. And this is something that we're not going to dwell on too much, but was really the central question that spurred the advent of Kabbalah, right, in the 12th century in Spain, and then the writings of the Arizal, and even in Chassidut, is this larger question of if God is everything and infinite, so how is there room, as it were, for anything, right? Doesn't that somehow detract from or contradict the concept of God in and of itself? So kind of understanding the idea of how removed is God, is there room for the world? There's a lot of deep questions here. And kind of what I wanted to dwell on are a couple of Mamarei Chazal. So Chazal, right, they don't ever address these types of philosophical issues very directly or systematically. The first time that this type of question is raised, I think, it's like I said, is maybe in the medieval times. And then Kabbalah versus the rationalistic schools of the Rambam, they kind of had a war about that, and then it evolved and became richer as time went on. But from Chazal, right, there aren't any treatises or real systematic ways of dealing with this type of question. Rather, there is, as there is in general with Midrash, kind of pieces here and there of different, maybe more poetically phrased ways of approaching this type of question. So what I'd like to do is just explore a few of those and see how Chazal understood if God was, as it were, ba'elyonim or b'tachtonim, right? Is God's primary location one of transcendence, removed from the world, or is it one where he dwells in the world? And how are we supposed to, and really I think what else makes Chazal unique or different from the later philosophical and Kabbalistic and mystic approaches to this question is, whereas later schools of thought in Judaism are focused on the question in and of itself. In other words, they want to know objectively how to understand God in a metaphysical sense. Chazal, I think, seem less interested in that, and more interested in kind of the practical implications of it. In other words, I don't necessarily care whether God is up there or down here. What's more important is then what does that mean in terms of how I should relate to Him. And ultimately, the practical implication of this is what's motivating a lot of the discussion. So let's start with the Gemara from our sugya in Yevamot on Kufay, and then we'll look at a couple of the other sugyot, and we'll look at what some of the Mefarshim on our sugya say. And then we'll conclude with a passage from Sefer HaBahir, which is probably one of the oldest Kabbalistic texts. It predates the Zohar by some decades, and its opening passage kind of alludes to this paradox that we discussed before. So the Gemara in Yevamot on Daf Kuf Hei Amud Bet says as follows: Rabbi Chiya Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi Havuyat Vei. So two Amoraim, Rabbi Chiya and Rabbi Shimon, were sitting. Patach ad minayu ve'amar המתפלל צריך שיתן עיניו למטה. שנאמר והיו עיניי ולבי שם כל הימים. So the question is, when you're davening, where are you supposed to focus yourself? The idea is when you're praying to God. So really what's behind this is, where are you supposed to look? Where are you supposed to concentrate? So one of these two rabbis said a person should cast his eyes downward. The other one said he should cast his eyes upward. Right? Is God primarily El Bashamayim, or is God primarily not Bashamayim but Ba'aretz? And right, I think what is behind this, aside from the practical halachic question of where you're supposed to look, is where are you supposed to be directing your thoughts, is where does God's primary essence lie, as it were. The Gemara continues and says, Ata Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi the Gabayhu. A third rabbi comes to them. V'amar lu b'mai askitu. So he asked them, what are you guys talking about? Amru le b'tfilah. They said, we're talking about davening. Amar lu kach amar Abba. So he said to them, my father Rabbi Shmuel taught me, המתפלל צריך שיתן עיניו למטה ולבו למעלה, כדי שיתקיימו שני מקורות הללו עד ההכי. So he taught that a person, when he davens, should direct his eyes downward, but his heart heavenward, so that you can fulfill both. Now, it's not an either-or proposition, but there's a way to combine the two, where God is both lemata, and so you should direct your eyes lemata, and also lemala, so you should direct your heart lemala. So you kind of have here perhaps three different approaches. One which emphasizes the aspect of God being Bashamayim, sitting on a throne or whatever anthropomorphic description, but ultimately that God is transcendent. Versus one that says when you're praying to God, you're praying to Him as someone who you have a relationship with, and He's in this world. And so you should daven to Him as though He's Lamata. And then the third saying that somehow you can reconcile those two and direct your energies to both at the same time. Because God is both Bashamayim and both Lamala and Lamata. A couple of other Gemaras, just to give us a bit of more context of different midrashic approaches to this. So the Gemara in Sota and Daf Hei Amud Aleph, it quotes a pasuk from Yeshayahu where it talks about God being ve'et daka u'shfal ruach, that God is with the contrite and with the humble of spirit. So it's unclear what this means. Rav Huna v'Rav Chisda. So it's a machloket. Chad amar atid daka. Ati daka, v'chad amar ani et daka. Okay, so the machloket is, what does it mean v'et daka, and with the contrite? So one says it means that the contrite come to me, and the other says that I am with the contrite. In other words, one says that I bring the daka up, the shval ruach up, and the other says that I come down to the daka and the shval ruach. But obviously, either way, the pasuk is saying that God is with them. But the question is, right? There's this gap. Who's meeting who? So the Gemara continues, "Umistabra kamanda ama arni et daka," and it seems the one who's correct is the one who says that God goes down to the contrite and humble of spirit. Sharei HaKadosh Baruch Hu hiniach kol harim ugvaot v'yishra shchinato al Har Sinai. God came down onto Har Sinai to give the Torah. V'lo gava Har Sinai lamala, and He didn't uproot Har Sinai and bring it up to the heavens. So the Gemara sees in that a support for the idea that God lowers Himself, and not that God brings up to him. Amar Rav Yosef le'olam yilmad adam midat kono. Rav Yosef says a person should always learn based on the knowledge of his Creator, based on God's actions. As Rav Yosef says, and then obviously there's a practical, ethical implication of this, which is that just as God did that, so too we should try to emulate him. And so just as God left all the big mountains and he rested on Har Sinai, and he left all the big trees and he rested on the sneh, so too we should always try to rest on the Daka U'Shval Ruach and lower ourselves and humble ourselves. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But what prefaces it is this discussion, which could, in some sense, also be interpreted as a question around: is God primarily up there, or is God primarily down here? Another example is the Psikta Rabati and Perek Hey. So right after the Mishkan is finished being built, right? So we're told that God's presence comes down and rests on the Shechina, the Shechina v'shachanti betoch b'nei Yisrael. So at the end of the consecration of the Mishkan, we're told Vaychas ha'anan et ha'oel u'chvod Hashem aleh et ha'Mishkan. So the cloud covers everything, and then the glory of God fills the Mishkan. So how is that possible, right? Katuv hinei hashemayim u'shmei hashemayim lo yichalkelucha. Right, that all the heavens and the hosts of the heavens, they cannot contain God. V'chan katuv u'chvod Hashem aleh et ha'Mishkan. Now you're telling me God can concentrate His glory in a specific place? So Amar Rabbi Yeshua de Sichnin b'shem Rabbi Levi, Lema davar domeh, I'll bring you a parable. Leme'ara ptucha al sfat hayam. So it's like a cave that it's open to the sea. Ga'ash hayam v'nitmaleh ha'me'ara. Ve'hayam lo chasar. So, right, as the sea, the waves crash into the cave, and the cave fills up and empties out of water. But the sea does not lack. Whether there's water in the cave or not in the cave, the sea is unaffected. כך אף על פי שכתב וכבוד השם עלה את המשכן, אלא העליונים והתחתונים לא חסרו מזיו כבודו של הקדוש ברוך הוא. כשם שכתב עלו את השמיים ואת הארץ אני מלא נאום השם. לפי כך כתב כאן ויהי כשם שהייתה השכינה, etc., etc. Essentially the idea being that there's no contradiction here, that it's possible for God to fill a specific area, for his divine energy to be concentrated in a specific area without it detracting from the larger transcendence of God. And his extra concentration in one place doesn't mean that he's less concentrated in other places. It's like this cave where the water comes in, but the sea remains the same. There's lots of other parables in the Kabbalistic literature as well, right? Like a light, right? That the sun, so the sun it has light that comes out of the sun, but the sun is not detracted, or the fact once the light leaves the sun, it's not as though the sun is less because of it. You still have the light. So the idea being that somehow there's this way to reconcile in some way that's hard for us to comprehend the infinity of God with a finite concentration of God in a particular area. And that's how we're meant to understand the idea of God coming down onto Har Sinai, coming down onto the Mishkan, and all these other instances where God comes down in Tanakh, that somehow you have this tension between the transcendence and immanence of God, but it doesn't lead to any contradiction, and the two can work together. And then, again, the practical question is his primary essence amongst us or up there? Right? Obviously, Chazal also have different names. I should have said this before, right? Different names for different aspects of God, right? The Shekhinah is how Chazal refer to God that's immanent, right? That there's, I think in Megillah and Daf Kaftet, it says that, right, God, the Shekhinah accompanies Bnei Yisrael through all of their exiles. It's as though God is literally in the world going with Bnei Yisrael. And then you have other names for God, like Hamakom, which refer more to his transcendence, his unknowability, and his total incomprehensibility, impossible to comprehend. So these are just a few of the passages that I wanted to bring from Chazal. Let's look now at some of the Mefarshim on our Gemara about understanding the difference between Yitain Einav Lamata, Yitain Einav Lamala when it comes to davening. Again, they're less we'll see that one of them in particular does deal with this larger philosophical question, but they're also dealing with the more technical aspects of this discussion. So the Maharsha says that this machloket actually parallels another machloket, which is brought in the Yerushalmi. So the Maharsha says as follows: Mishecharav Beit HaMikdash plige. What they're arguing about is only after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, about where you're supposed to focus your energies when you're davening. ודורש מכל ימים, דאף בזמן הזה עיני ולבי וגומר, שיש שכינה שם. והכי מפורש בירושלמי, הרב שמעון בר נחמן וכולי, where it says in the Yerushalmi, משחרב בית המקדש, השם בשמיים, כיסאו סלק שכינתו בשמיים. So Rabbi Shimon bar Nachman says in the Yerushalmi that once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, God's Shekhinah left this world, and it removed itself to his seat up in heaven. In other words, the more imminent presence of God that was in this world due to the merit of the Beit HaMikdash, once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, so God's presence was kind of removed, that imminence was removed, and God is only transcendent, as it were. Rabbi Elazar ben Padat omer, ben charav ben lo charav eno zaz mimkomo, shneamar v'inu einav v'libi sham kol yamim. Right? Now Rabbi Elazar ben Padat says, no, just because the Beit HaMikdash wasn't destroyed, his presence did not leave its place, that he's still in the world, as it says, etc. Uman de palig nami hacha. And so the Maharsha says that it's a similar discussion here. Shiten C'inev Lemala. So the one who says that you should point your eyes heavenward, Shneimar Nasa Levenu V'Gomer Lo B'Shamayim Yirmiyah Amoro La'achar Churban. Right? That when you're quoting that pasuk, it's a pasuk from Yirmiyahu, or from Eicha actually, and Yirmiyahu is the supposed author is the author of Eicha. So he wrote that after the Churban. Al Bizman Shebeit HaMikdash Kayam L'Chulei Alma C'inev Lemata. K'mo Shekatuv V'Shamata L'Tachana L'Dacha V'Gomer. So what the Maharsha claims is that this whole discussion of where you should be focusing is only within the context of Bnei Yisrael in exile. When Bnei Yisrael are not in exile and the Beit HaMikdash stands, according to the Maharsha, everybody would agree you point your eyes downward because God's immanence is the dominant place for him. And it's only when we're in exile and God is mastir panav that he removes himself from this world, and then he's primarily transcendent. Okay, etc., etc. Okay, uva Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yossi v'Amar pshara b'nehem. Right, and then the third guy who came and said a compromise between the two, Einav Lamata velibbo Lemala. You should point your eyes down and your heart up. Ramaz shikar shchinato silek lashamayim. That he says they're both right, and ultimately the ikar, right, the essence of God really did remove himself from the world and went back into the heavens. אבל עיניו למטה, כי לא סילק ממש שכינתו משם, כי דעתו לבוא עוד שם בבית המקדש, בבניינו, לקיים מה שנאמר כל הימים. Okay, etc., etc. That somehow, again, you have this idea that at certain points in history, God's essence is more concentrated, that there's this, God is in the world. But even when we're in exile, even though some of that is removed, he's still in the world. So it's kind of this in between. So you didn't devote your eyes. You look downward, but you also point your heart heavenward as a way to accept and understand that idea. Okay, and then the rest of it is less important for our purposes. So the Maharsha ties it to that discussion, and he roots it in a historical context of it being the question of transcendence and immanence of God. Actually, it depends on what time in history you're talking about. That when the Mishkan was built, then the immanence was stronger. When the Beit HaMikdash was built, the immanence was stronger. The Shekhinah came down into the world, it was present. And then when those are destroyed, and when Bnei Yisrael are exiled, so then, even though there's some passages that say the Shekhinah goes with him, there's others that say, no, God left this world, and he's more removed. So that's the Maharsha's approach. If we look quickly at I believe it's the Rif. So, actually, we can skip this. I don't want to, because this is dealing specifically with Eretz Yisrael versus Chutz La'aretz. It's a bit technical. What's perhaps more interesting for our purposes is the Anaf Yosef. So the Anaf Yosef writes as follows: Rabbi Chia v'Rabbi Shimon bar Rebbe, plige b'pelukta de plige b'perek kama de sota. L'mar savar ati deka u'mar savar ani et deka. שהרי השחש הקדוש ברוך הוא שכינתו על סיני ולא הגביה לסיני. First of all, the Anaf Yosef draws the parallel between Argamar and Yevamot and the one that we saw in Sotah, which asks, does God come down with the humble of spirit, or does he bring them up to him? Lachen man da'amar עיניו למטה, סביר לעני את צדקה. So the one who says point your eyes downwards, like the one who says that God lowers himself to be with the humble of spirit. והשם יתברך משרה שכינתו למטה, and God brings his shechina down into the world. Man da'amar libo למעלה, and the one who says you should point your heart heavenward, סביר לעתיד דקה, that God lifts them up to him. מגביה לדקה למעלה. ורבי יוסי סביר לעיניו למטה מתפלל בהכנעה, ליבו להמשיך שפע השכינה מלמעלה למטה. Right, Rabbi Yossi says the middle ground. Then the Anaf Yosef says the following. ובספר יד יוסף כתב משום דלכאורה קשה. So the Yad Yosef wrote as follows. He says this whole concept is difficult. כיוון שהשם יתברך יודע כל תעלומות לב, ויודע מה שאדם צריך. So, since God knows the innermost thoughts of man, and knows what man needs, למה מונע הקדוש ברוך הוא מהאדם עד שיתפלל לו? So why does God withhold things from us until we pray for them? So the answer is that this is really what this machloket is coming to address. So these two are really coming to, they're not giving a technical, it's true they're talking about do you point your eyes down here or up there, but really what they're arguing about is the purpose of davening, what the goal behind tefillah really is. So one says point your eyes downward, להראות שכוונת התפילה להאמין שהקדוש ברוך הוא משגיח בה למטה, להוציא מסברת האומרים דאין השגחה חס ושלום, אלא עד גלגל הירח, אלא משגיח בה למטה. כדכתיב, היו עיניי ולבי שם כל ימים. So the one who says you point your eyes downward is basically to emphasize within ourselves the belief that God is involved in the world, right? That he's not just this transcendent, unmoved mover, but that he has immanence, that he's involved in the world, he intercedes, and that he listens to our prayers. V'idach savar, she'adayin yesh to'elet acher b'tfilah. But the one who said to point your eyes heavenward said that there's another benefit for tfilah, שבהתפללו יודע שהקדוש ברוך הוא למעלה מהכל, ויש לו יכולת למלאות כל שאלותיו, ולכך צריך שיכוון בו למעלה. That, on the other hand, right, you also need to relate to the transcendent God who is above everything and has the ability, is omniscient, and can do whatever he wants. ובא רבי שמעון ואמר שני תועלת יחד יש בתפילה. That really both are true, ושקונים הם. ויביאו שניהם שכך אמר אבא המתפלל צריך שיתן עיניו למטה ולבו למעלה כדי שתקומו שני עקרונות הללו ולהראות אלו שני העיקרים הגדולים ההשגחה והיכולת ולכן תקנו האבות העולם התפילות עד כאן לשונו. That these two great principles of one השגחה פרטית but the other that God can do whatever, he has this, this ability to do anything, or sicholet, that he's omniscient or omnipotent, and that the idea behind tefillah is to to have those two ideas rooted within you, and so that's why you should both direct your heart heavenward and your eyes downward. So here the Anaf Yosef is touching on the more philosophical concept behind all of this, but ultimately again he's tying it to really what the practical purposes for the people who are davening is like how do you view God and how he relates to the world. And that he's both, right? That both he is, above and beyond, but also he's part of the world. And right, and I think ultimately that's kind of the ultimate approach of Chazal and of traditional rabbinic Judaism in general, right? Is the Avinu Malkeinu paradigm that God is both this king, right, who's above us, removed, transcendent, but also he's our father in the sense that he has a relationship with us, right? And when we daven, we do Avinu Malkeinu. He's both immanent and he's transcendent, and somehow those two don't contradict. Like I said, right, Chazal don't touch on why those two don't contradict from a metaphysical perspective. Like how is that possible? But it's just an assumption that's made, which I think is rooted in large part in Tanakh, about discussions of God being ultimately transcendent, but that he's able to lower his Shekhinah down into the world, and we hear about that happening many times. Vayered Hashem, he comes down to Migdal Bavel, he comes down to see what mankind is doing in the beginning of Bereshit, all the way through many stories where God manifests himself in the world, but ultimately, right, he has his throne up in heaven. I just want to finish with this passage from Sefer Bahir. So, again, like I said, Sefer Bahir, it predates the Zohar, and it's this very dense, esoteric work where it's not clear what a lot of it means. It's 200 prakim long. The first parak touches on this, is really the source for the Kabbalistic later, the whole the development around the theology or theosophy behind this idea of God being able to be both immanent and transcendent, and how you reconcile those, right? So, and kind of what ended up developing in the thought of the Arizal was the idea of tzimtzum, which embraces the paradox and says somehow God withdrew his essence and created a vacuum that allowed for creation to exist, and then a ray of his essence went into the vacuum, so he was in the vacuum but also removed from the vacuum. Right? Difficult concepts to understand. What I just wanted to touch on is how the Sefer Bahir opens. So it says as follows: Amar Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, Katuv echad omer. It says in Yov, Ve'ata lo ra'u or bahir hu bashchakim. Ve'katuv echad omer yashet choshech sitro. Ve'omer anan v'alafel svivav kashya. Okay, so one pasuk says that you can't, right? That we can't see the radiant splendor or the brilliant light up in heaven that emanates from God. And the other pasuk says that God is surrounded by darkness, by gloom, by cloud. So Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana says kasha, right? Is it dark up there or is it light up there? Like what is surrounding God? Which is it? He says the third pasuk comes and tells me how to reconcile them. It says in Tehillim Kuf Yud Lamed Tet, Gam choshech lo yachshich mimcha, v'layla keyom ya'ir kechashecha ke'ora. So even what is dark is not dark for you, right? And night is like day and is bright for you. Darkness is like light. So what does that mean? In other words, what does it mean that God is surrounded by light, God is surrounded by darkness, but what is dark is for God light? So the way that this is, from what I've read, the way this is understood by many Kabbalistic commentaries is that essentially it's talking about how this paradox can exist, how if there's this infinite being, right, if God is the Ein Sof, as it were, is this transcendent, infinite, indifferentiated being, how is there room for existence? How did that come to be? And so the solution that's offered here is that it's all about perspective. In other words, from the perspective of the created, of man, when we look at the world, we see and perceive an independent existence. And so we see God as being dark in the sense that we are independent, and then perhaps there's this transcendent being, whatever it is, but ultimately God is shrouded in darkness in the sense of being able to really understand his true essence, and we perceive this independent existence and materialistic world. But what is dark for us is light for God. In other words, from God's perspective, everything is light, everything is undifferentiated. That in the essence of Ein Sof, all of creation is subsumed into his infinity, and it's as though it doesn't have an independent existence at all. This is, I say, a very deep concept, and I personally have an easier time wrapping my head around it when I compare it to the concept of infinity in mathematics, which is an idea, right? Infinity is not a number, it's a concept, and it's something that has led to a lot of issues in the development of math. But ultimately, the way you can think about it is like the numbers, right? You add up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., etc. Eventually, you get up to infinity, right? If you continue for an infinite amount of time. Infinity plus 1, infinity times 1,000,000 is still infinity. In other words, each individual number, or even all of the numbers, are, compared to infinity, non-existent. They're null. They just get sucked into infinity, mathematically. but they still have an independent existence. In other words, from their own perspective, when I'm dealing in a world of a finite numbers, so 1 is different from 2, is different from 3, and they have existence and they're logically consistent with each other. But whenever I compare them to infinity or start talking about infinity, and I move from the world of the finite to the infinite, then numbers cease to have any meaning because they all get subsumed into the infinite. So perhaps this is maybe mystically what's being alluded to here, in the sense that even though there is some independent existence, paradoxically, when compared or when seen from the perspective of the Ein Sof of God, it all becomes subsumed and undifferentiated and part of his essence and is not different, but somehow also it emanates, just as the infinity can also live in conjunction with independent numbers that exist, while still recognizing that they kind of lose their value when compared to infinity. So too with all of existence, with all of the material world. So again, there's a whole lot to say about that, but I just wanted to kind of touch on this because it's a very deep topic, and it was alluded to in a more limited sense in the Ein Yaakov, in Yevamot Daf Kuf Hei Amud Bet. Shkoyach.